Good day, ladies, gentlemen, and anyone in between. Today we have another devlog from the one, the only, the sluggish, the glovish, it's Sluglove!
And welcome back to Devlog. In this part I go over my levels chunk generator system, how levels are actually created as the player moves through them, not procedurally, but organically, to make sure the player can respawn into areas and items are correctly regenerated for the player to navigate through areas multiple times. So here is an interesting point. Despite my, some would say, obsessive devlogs about everything I have ever done, I've never made one about actually making a level. Anyway, this is the basis for how levels are created and played through in the game. The idea for these sort of level setup systems is for them not to be a short level, as in a Mario, a 2D Mario style, but to be more complicated and actually take a long time to get through, but have save points as you go through the level. A good example of this would be the way levels are organized in Celeste or Sunblaze, with the levels going from one section of a level to another very quickly if you're playing well, but if you are stuck on one section, you can be on that one section for quite some time, having the player being able to save and quit and return to these points. And one level, in some instances, may be taking an hour to complete, depending on difficulty. Essentially, the idea for my game would be the game has maybe 7 levels, but they're very, very long and very complicated, and there's multiple different things you can do in these levels. Maybe closer to an open world 2D game, but not actually open world. A level isn't just go from point A to point B, it's go in this big convoluted path around a big level and there's some stuff to do. Essentially, I needed a system that would be able to load levels into these chunks, reset chunks as they are exited or entered into, meaning a level can be any size, but certain sections of the level are loaded at a specific time, which is usually done organically for Unity anyway, but also that certain sections of the level can be reset. For example, maybe moving platforms are used in a certain section, but they need to be at a certain point in the level and will only be there once the player has moved from one point to another. In these setups, these moving platforms will be reset once the player has done these things. So, how does it work, you may be asking? All I have is a script set up for these room chunks that will detect when the player is entering a new chunk or if the player needs to reload a certain amount of chunks, so I can feed this an index of whatever chunk we have currently wanted to load. We then check all relative loaded chunks, these being every single chunk that is currently active, these being every single section of the level that is currently active, and then every single chunk we need to load. This is the current chunk we have been fed, so the one we are entering or died and respawned into, or needs to be loaded for whatever reason, and then every adjacent chunk. So what we're loading is one section of the level, and then every section that we could transition from this section into. So when the player moves into these sections, it is seamlessly loaded into and there isn't any issue. All I do then is, if the chunk is already loaded, I don't do anything. If the chunk needs to be loaded, I will create a duplicate of the chunk object and then load into this chunk object. So I make a new chunk. Now that I'm thinking of it, I could just enable the object and then only load the items that need resetting in the chunk. Yeah, that's a way better idea. So this setup is basically how every single chunk in-game would be loaded into or reset when the player dies. If a chunk is in our list of loaded chunks and doesn't need to be loaded anymore, we will destroy it. And that's basically it for loading and deloading chunks. There's probably a smarter way to do this, but in the current setup this seemed the easiest way to handle level generation or levels being placed in-game. In terms of when the player dies, this is very simple. All we'll do is we'll find the relative chunk the player respawns into. This is used by invisible respawn points that are placed around the level. Since I want respawning to be very seamless, just being the player placed on the natural organic point they should be placed into. So if you've finished a difficult section, you'll have an automatic checkpoint placed in that section of the level. or at the beginning of a new chunk, things like this. These checkpoints will be very seamless, so if the player dies, they will just be placed in wherever they would hope to be for the player. The way dying in-game is handled and the way respawning system in-game is handled is a little bit complicated, so I'll make a different devlog for that system, but all you need to know is that there is a system that keeps track of what chunk we should respawn into and where in this respawn chunk we should be placed. In this instance, we will delete all of our chunks, as in deloading them because they're no longer needed, because I need to reset that information, because the player is respawning into them. And then we'll just load up these chunks again, now that the player is respawning into them. Again, now that I'm saying this out loud, maybe just destroy the objects that need resetting and keep the rest of the objects that can stay just enabled. But basically every object in the level is being reset because these objects may be needed to navigate through the level now that we've respawned into it. Then all we do is we transition the UI. This basically just puts a black screen over the player's view so they can't see levels being generated. And then we make these levels again, resetting them, placing them in their correct places, and moving the player. Then we deload this UI, and we have our levels generated or reset back to their original point now that the player has died. Again, this means things like item pickups or barriers or moving platforms that may be needed to finish the level have been reset back to normal. And that's basically it. This was more complicated than my notes. Once again, this is a very simple system. This is basically just the basis of a basic idea that I want for leveled systems. So this is the setup for how these levels will be organically placed and organized in-game space to make it so the player can easily navigate through them and not see the seams, quote unquote, of the level as they are generated and loaded into. This may all be very common knowledge for you, a big brain game developer, but I have small peanut brain and I'd never done levels before and I was just very happy with the system. So I think it works pretty well for my current game system. I'm now going to go and fix all of those pesky issues I said mid-sentence as recording my devlog. So don't bug me about them in the comments. I'll get very, very mad. In the next devlog we're going to talk about dying. Specifically, if the player dies in-game, what happens? This actually has a lot more logic behind it, so that devlog will be more interesting. Rambling aside, I liked making this system. It makes levels easier to design for, it makes movement throughout levels a lot easier for me to make in system space. It's just a very easy made, useful system that I have used for making it so a giant level isn't created. I can just make chunks for a level and I can slot them together. Goodbye! Devlog over!